kind of an important section to take a look at, because in this latter section of Romans chapter 1, Paul's going to list for us some pretty sobering issues. He's going to lay very clearly a contrast between righteousness and unrighteousness. And so we've been looking at this for the first 15 verses or so in the text. The Apostle Paul really just kind of has a discussion about thankful that he has a chance to write to them, hoping to be able to go see them at some point and visit with them. Just very, very typical kind of introductory things that he shares with them. And then he finally makes that great bold statement, in verse 16, for I am not a what? I'm not ashamed. Not ashamed of the gospel. For what reason? For it is the power of God unto salvation to the Jew first and also to the Greek. And remember, we talk about really that idea of Gentile and Greek is anybody, foreign in some senses. For therein inside the gospel is the righteousness of God revealed from faith to faith, as is written, the just shall live by faith. And so he's not ashamed of the gospel because it's the power of God unto salvation. In it, how is it the power of God unto salvation? Because in it is a righteousness that comes by faith that God reveals unto us through that message. There's really, if you think about it, only two ways you can be justified. Either we can be justified by our perfect actions, right? We can live sinlessly. Well, we can't. But that would be one means by which to be justified, would be to be perfectly sinless and live in such a way that you would say that's a perfectly just man because he abided by all the rules. Or you can be justified through a process by which God has designed. And that process, he says, is by faith. And then once you understand the righteousness of God revealed in the gospel that brings us to faith, then what must we do with that? That's right. Then the just, how do they become just? How are they justified? Not by perfection, but by faith in the righteousness revealed in the gospel, because it is the power of God unto salvation. Remember, we talked about all those fors and because and wherefores all the way down through these verses. And so there's a reason why the gospel has power. There's a reason why we need to honor the righteousness that's therein. There's a benefit to being justified by faith because what's coming, according to verse 18? Wrath of God. The only other alternative, there are basically only two alternatives here that Paul gives. Either there's justification by faith, which is just simply the opposite of righteousness, and those who hold the truth in unrighteousness. Because that which, in verse 19, may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has showed it unto them, for the invisible things of Him from the creation of the world are clearly seen. There's plenty of evidence, we talked about this Sunday, that allows for men to understand clearly who God is, the reason why they should be pursuing Him, and to avoid the consequences of unrighteousness. But Paul talks about a problem in verse 21. He said they refused to remember Him. They've refused to know Him any longer. They refused, when they knew God, they did not glorify Him as God, nor were they thankful. But they began to think in their own minds that they, verse 22, were wise. But in so doing, they become foolish. And they even changed the glory of the uncorruptible God into the images of man in creation. And that's the contrast. There's justification by faith that comes through a righteousness of God, or walk the path of unrighteousness and sinful behaviors, and the wrath of God is coming. And Paul kind of gives it a kind of a cut and dry kind of circumstance as it comes to that. That's kind of where we left off Sunday morning. And so then he said in verse 24, wherefore God also gave them up to uncleanness through the lust of their own hearts to dishonor their own bodies between themselves. Has God, let me rephrase that, does God force anybody to seek justification by faith? No. Does God force anybody to live by the righteous message that's revealed in the gospel? No. It's an offer. Okay? Here's what's coming. the wrath of God against all unrighteousness and ungodliness, and those who hold the truth in unrighteousness. That's what's coming. The antidote, if you will, the way to avoid that wrath, is to seek the power of the gospel and the righteousness revealed within it that comes by justification by faith. But God isn't forcing anybody to do that. And if man chooses to give himself over to dishonor the very creative body that God has given unto us, that's our choice to make. God isn't going to force anyone to make a decision as it relates to their behavior. They even went as far, verse 25, to change the truth of God into a lie and worshiped and served the creature more than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. Once you go down that path of abandoning God, then the next natural step is to simply start replacing Him with other things. And so with their own vain imaginations, they begin to replace God with other things, including aspects of the creation, rather than honoring the Creator Himself. Go ahead.
He's talking to Christian people, right?
Yeah.
That has the Word and everything like that changed it over to a lie, right?
Yeah. Well,
I mean, he's talking to everybody, but he's also talking to Christians that fell away here too.
Potentially, yes. There's potentially an audience here. I guess why I'm hesitating yet is I'm trying to, in my own mind, think about, is this a warning to them to avoid this, or is this an accusation that they've already done this? Yeah, and my thought is that number one, he's warning them, don't you fall prey to this. My conclusion would be they've understood the power of God unto salvation already. Don't abandon it. Don't walk this path that leads to wrath and destruction. There's a whole host of folks who have turned the righteousness of God upside down. There's a whole host of folks who have used their own bodies for dishonor rather than honor that God would have them to. There's a whole host of folks who've changed the truth of God into a lie. And so, to me, it's more of a warning. It's a reality that some have. I don't know it's an accusation that they have in terms of the Christians there alone. And if so, then they are in a mess when you read the rest of the text.
Maybe that's why he wanted to get there.
And I'm sure. And being Rome, the influence of these sinful, unrighteous behaviors that are going to be listed here in a few moments are obviously rampant. And they're going to have a very difficult time. They're going to have a challenge to make sure they overcome those temptations to fall prey to that unrighteousness. But to me, to really, the best I can understand it, I believe he's simply making a contrast. There's power of God unto salvation, justification by faith. And here's why you need it. Because the wrath of God is coming, because here's what man has done, generically. Not necessarily specifically to those Christians.
Well, I was going to say, look to where he's sending this letter. What is the biggest sinful place in the land at that time?
Yeah.
And telling them, that this is what's going to happen to these people and what they have done.
Yeah. And just simply because you have a choice, the ability to make these decisions doesn't mean it comes without consequence. And I think that's where he's going to point eventually here. That to reject God as the Creator and to flip nature, in some senses, upside down is only to your own demise. Seems to be the direction that he's heading here in the next few verses.
I agree with you that that's the whole point of this. It is a warning to them. He's showing them what the Gentile world has become without God. He's saying, look at what happened. Look in the past. Look throughout history. Here's what's happened when you reject God. Look at the progression. Look at where this has gone. And it's in some ways a very sobering warning for us. So when you look at the picture of our world today, there ain't a whole lot of difference.
Yeah. And I'm going to follow that path eventually here. Go ahead, Ross.
You notice when we use the word context,
Yeah.
and I agree with what was just said. The context is showing this is what the Gentiles, they knew about God,
Yeah.
but they didn't keep him, they didn't honor him. And so that down there in the verse it says they exchanged the truth for a lie, is what one version says.
Yeah.
In verse 25.
Right.
They exchanged the truth for a lie. And that happened in the Garden of Eden a couple of times.
Yeah. And I think that is kind of the
So it's a warning to the Romans.
right. That these things are still challenging, and they need to be cautious.
Don't think it's not still out there.
Well, it has always been and continues to be, unfortunately. Other thoughts or comments? So verse 26, for this cause God gave them up unto vile affections. For even their women did change the natural use into that which is against nature. And likewise also the men, leaving the natural use of the woman, burned in their lust one toward another, men with men, working that which is unseemly, and receiving in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. I read a lot of thoughts about these two verses. We can simplify it probably and just look at it as the idea that God created man and woman in a certain way. And He created them with a certain natural purpose. And the world in their day, the world in the days well prior to Rome, the issue has been around for a long time where men turned upside down the very natural purposes that God had created within men and women. And that shouldn't surprise anybody. Once you vacate the Creator, once you turn your mind away from the Creator, then the next natural step would be to simply start looking at the very nature that God has created us in with very different eyes. And so he says the women have done it, the men have done it, and the consequences of that behavior is challenging them. And even to the point where he says there's consequence to that choice. They receive in themselves that recompense of their error which was meet. I think there's other contexts of Scripture that illustrate that same point, by the way, that when you choose a sinful path, it brings hardship. It brings difficulty. And that's the same here in this text.
Somehow there's no qualifying word used to distinguish women and men. I guess assume that it would refer to those that are married and those that are not married, including the whole sect of women and the whole sect of men. Am I right?
Yes, I've always viewed it as generic. I'm looking real quick because you asked, and just pardon the scroll for a second on the screen. I'm trying to look at these. There's distinct words. There's distinct words being used for from women and men in the text. Very generically, the word for that's translated women in this text simply is female. And so I think that it's generic. Women, female, man, male, have made these choices and decisions that have caused these difficulties. So I think there's a very generic concept here in terms of that. Not necessarily any implication about married or unmarried or anything like that.
And that recompense of their error is immediate in verse 24. They have dishonored their own bodies. They've dishonored it. They've brought shame to what God meant to be glorious.
And because of that, there are both spiritual and physical consequences when we abandon the order in which God has placed things in. And to me, it's much simpler than I think we make it out. I mean, there's obvious a manner in which God created He, them, that the Genesis account records for us. There's a very definitive view. And I think sometimes what happens in culture is that we blur the lines between civil liberties and freedoms and spiritual principle. And so the minute you begin to talk about spiritual principle, where this text clearly condemns the unnatural use of women and women and men, you're labeled in a certain with hate speech and those kinds of things. But I'm not saying anything. People have every civil liberty and freedom to live how they want to live, and the laws of the land will govern the civil side of it. I'm just saying this is what God said about it, and this is clearly His message concerning when the natural use of women and men are turned upside down. This is what God said about that for the Apostle Paul, and whether we choose to honor or dishonor that, obviously He said that He was willing to let them do that. God's willing to let man make his choices, not without consequence, but He's willing to let man make his choice, how he'll behave and how he won't behave. And all I'm simply doing is examining what God has said about the matter and trying to encourage folks to appreciate that there's a righteousness and an unrighteousness that comes from God. And His standard is pretty clear on this. But by the way, I try not to make that the sole issue of Romans chapter 1, because he's going to get in a list here in a minute that includes all kinds of things that are against the nature in which God has established us in. And we've got to honor all of those things that he's going to label as unrighteous in this narrative. Thoughts or comments? So even as they did not like to retain God, verse 28, in their knowledge, God gave them over to a reprobate mind, His words, not mine, to do those things which are not convenient. Being filled then, once you make the choice that you do not even have to honor the very nature in which God has created us, it will send us down a road of all kinds of things. If I am at spiritual liberty to violate the very natural means by which God has created, then once I make that decision that I can even violate nature and the manner in which God's creation was put forth, then what's left? That road goes wherever it wants to go, and that's what I believe Paul's saying. Once that choice has been made, once we've decided, I don't care what God thinks, I don't care what this verse says, I don't care what this, and again, God says man can do that. I'm not forcing anybody to behave a certain way. But Paul's saying, I'm telling you that when you abandon God, when you refuse to retain Him in your knowledge, He'll turn you over to that and let you do anything you choose, even if it's not convenient, even if it doesn't fit the pattern of God's will. But it's going to bring consequence. And it leads to other issues. They're filled with what? Generically, verse 29, all unrighteousness. It's the next progression. Once we've abandoned the connection between ourselves and the Creator, the next progression is this to go into all kinds of unrighteousness. Whether it be fornication, all illicit relationships of that sort included in those things, whether it be wickedness, general misbehaviors, covetousness, the idea of coveting what others have to the point of even hating them because they have it, whether it be maliciousness, whether it be the envies that men have, whether it be murder, debate. By the way, that word's better translated contentions. Strife it's the same word that we get that sometimes is translated contention and strife. Deceit, malignities, whisperers, those who like to go behind people's backbiters, and whisper and tell tales and talk about one another. You know, sometimes we focus in on verses 26 and 27 and say, oh, how vile that is. Well, the vileness hasn't changed in the conversation. These are all vile in the eyes of God. They all equate to the same level of vileness in the eyes of God. They're all part of unrighteousness. And they're all part of a progression of folks furthering themselves further and further away from God. And then don't be surprised when they become what? Second thing in verse 30. Haters of God.
I think sometimes people think that when it says that God gave them up to a reprobate mind, that God's causing them to do this. And that's not the case. They chose not to know God, and consequently their ignorance was the intent before the act.
Yeah.
So consequently, they're the ones. He just decided, hey, if they're going to do this,
I turn you over to that.
Yeah. I'm done with it.
Yeah. And I believe all of these fit that same description. And then the next natural progression then is once I've decided that I don't care what the Creator has to say about what's natural and what's unnatural and what's right and what's wrong, then anytime someone even begins to bring the subject up, I become even, then he says, a hater of God. Hater of God. I don't know whether you all have followed. Obviously there's other connotations to the story, I suppose, that we can discuss, but it was fascinating to me. Did you see that I believe it was the New York subway system that a church bought an advertisement, and the advertisement said the perfect gift, and that's it. It says the perfect gift. And it has I think that's what it was, theperfectgift.com. And then a picture of shepherds. And they forced them to remove that advertisement out of the subway system. Because it was offensive. Now they could have put any host of things on there that would offend a faithful child and believer of God, and not a word one would be said. And my point is simply this. The fact is, more and more people have become not just disconnected unbelievers. There's more and more haters of God, seemingly. They are vehement. They're not contented to look at me as foolish, and I've always wondered about that. Why, if I'm really as foolish as they make me out to be, because I believe in God and worship Him regularly, then why are they worried about me? You know what I mean? Why are they worried about me? If I'm so ignorant and uneducated and so silly and foolish to think, then why are they concerned about anything that I would do or say? But it's because it's not about that. It's about this. It's about they've become more than just unbelievers. They've become haters of God in all things that pertain to His will and His message and the things that are His. And that's the scary part. It's one thing to deal with those who are just disconnected and uninterested. But it's a whole new thing when people raise the level of hatred. And I think we could evidence over and over and over again the cries of who hates who, and the evidences of that, of where the real hate is coming from. And I think honest people would see where it's really coming from and who it's directed at. They're despiteful, they're proud, they're boasters, they're inventors of evil things. I've been amazed at this for a long, long time, right? In the midst of some of the most vile and sorry conducts, disobedient to parents. It's an amazing thought that's how sobering to God that issue is. Yeah. and there's a level of truth to that, because if you'll disrespect the leadership in the home, what the next natural progression would be to disrespect the ultimate leadership and headship of the Creator.
It's amazing how we can be offended, but we don't speak out. But like, I can't get into Martinsville without being offended by a whole building.
Yeah, I was going to mention that, but yeah, you're right.
And come on, that's offensive to me. To
Yeah.
see that. And there are more than one. There are a
Yeah.
couple that have, profanity on the billboards, and we read them every day.
Yeah.
But we don't speak up, but they do.
Yeah, and I think that there's some of that, and sometimes, not that those aren't offensive, because this is a poor segue, but sometimes what the claims of where offense really occurred is there is nothing offensive at all, and then you have cases where these are genuinely offensive statements and things that are clearly put before the eyes, and that's perfectly acceptable. And I think that I think you're right. Maybe we do maybe allow for it too much, or at least we don't ever say anything. And maybe we've just become so accustomed, or we just conclude, well, nothing will ever be done, and so we just kind of live. And for me, that's always a hard balance, because I need a free society. To be able to speak and teach the gospel, I need a free society. And so I guess in some senses I have to kind of take the good with the bad with that. And because free speech is an important aspect of being able to let the gospel continue to spread. And so there's a fine line somewhere in there.
There's a saying that as the home goes, so goes the nation, so
Yeah.
goes everything else. And I've wondered myself, how could that be put in with all these other heinous crimes? But, as was stated already, it could lead to much, much more. And you can ask your own children if I haven't found that down the ranks.
Yeah.
So, yes.
Go ahead, Amy. I'm
I
sorry.
just want to add, disobedience is a learned thing.
Yeah.
So basically, this is being passed down to the next generation, and this is what the kids are growing up, and that's what they're exposed to and learning, and passing that on, unless they're being taught to love God.
Yeah. And we could spend a lot of time on this path, but it's an interesting dynamic, and I think that, and maybe it's always been, all I can do is speak about the time I'm in my experiences, but I do believe that in the last, I suppose if anybody lived in the 60s, that was an era where it was very anti-established rule and authority, and so you could see it then as well. But I've even seen, I know of a case where there were young people assembled in a religious context, and they got those young people away from the older folks that were there, and were basically encouraging them to fight the power. The elders don't really know what they're talking about. You all know what you're talking. You all know what the church really needs. You all know, and that's scary, because that's really the behavior that they're promoting, is the idea of disobedience. And it can permeate all kinds of things. Yeah.
You'll come up against people who are talking, like even having Bible classes in schools and stuff like that. But if you open that up that way, then there's people that I wouldn't want to teach my children about the Bible. So there's so many different ways to look at all of these things.
Yeah. It's an interesting conversation, that whether we can even explore every nuance of, but I'm with you. I think that there has to be some caution expressed, because what we ask for may simply just open up the door to another problem, and so you have to cut. And so I've always felt more comfortable with the idea of let's just not shut God out of the equation. Let Him be able to be spoken of freely in any setting. Let the Bible have free course as any other piece of knowledge that is shared. Those are the kinds of things that I feel more comfortable with. But I agree, you could end up in the same. We're trying to avoid an indoctrinization of some position, and we'll end up with another form of indoctrinization of something else. And so you're right. I think we have to be careful what we ask for and what our expectations are, and maybe quit passing blame. And let's go back to even kind of what Roger was saying and what Amy, I think, was driving at a little bit too, and quit blaming the school and start looking in the mirror for what's going on with us, and you know what I mean, and quit trying to affix responsibility over, well, if the school had more Bibles and talked about God, all will be well. Well, if we're still acting the same way as parents, it'll still be just as bad if we don't change our behaviors. As Forrest Gump said, that's all I've got to say about that. Let's move on. So, I'm sorry, Tom's going to keep me there. Go ahead, Tom.
He picked me up this one Monday morning, and he said, I left where I was going and went to this other one, and I started to say something. He said, I don't want to hear it, Yeah. I wanted to tell him something else. He said, I don't want to hear it.
Yeah.
That's what happened a lot of times.
And it's challenge. And once again, all of these things add up without understanding. They become covenant breakers. You can't trust them, right? They're covenant breakers. They'll make promises till the end of the world, but you know that there's no honoring of it. There's without natural affection. And that, by the way, isn't just a tie-in to 26 and 27, I don't believe. I think without natural affection it might be more parental and neighborly. And where is the natural affection, the natural God is love that He instilled in us as His creation? Why are we not expressing that and sharing that in the right ways? You see it so often where, and I've seen it both ways. I've seen parents, and you just wonder why. There doesn't seem to be any connection whatsoever of affection and concern for their children, and vice versa. I've seen some wonderful parents, and it doesn't make a lick of sense as to why the children are treating them the way they do. That's an unnatural thing, and we need to be careful about those things.
What amazes me about this is what Paul's almost revealing is an atheistic mindset.
Yeah.
Once you reject God, you deny God, you disavow God, you make yourself God.
Yeah.
Then all of these things that God considers sins, your human mind says, who says this is wrong? Who says it's wrong to backbite? Who says it's wrong to whisper? Who says it's wrong to murder? You look at in the first century, those things were right. Fornication, immorality, the worship of false gods, and all the things that went in with that. Those things in their mind were right, and I don't want to say it's comical, but it's ironic that atheists claim a sense of morality. Yeah. If you really look at the principles of atheism, they have no moral ground whatsoever to stand on. Because in that scenario, who's going to tell you what's right and wrong? When in your own mind, you decide what's right and wrong.
Yeah. If it's every man for himself, which, by the way, is a product of the evolutionary thought process of survival of the fittest, every man for himself, and then who's to say what the standard is? And maybe there's something we haven't really talked about here yet. Yeah, he's listing and he's going to bring it up. The judgment of God's coming against these things. And so I think there's a level of condemnation here. But maybe there's also the idea of hopefully somebody will read this list and they'll say, you're right. Envy's not good. Murder's not good. Contentiousness is not good. Backbiting. I don't like it when people talk about me behind. And you hope that they'll begin to build an understanding that all of those are a result of not retaining God in your knowledge. All of these this is why these things happen, is the abandonment of God has created. So if you don't like these things, if these things bother you, then recognize the core reason for it. And I think what happens for us so often is that so long as we don't like what it is God is condemning, then we're right with Him. And the moment it gets personal is when the challenge comes. You may have heard the story of the preacher preaching, and he talks about he talks about murder, and there's a fellow in the audience, preach, preacher, preach, and he talks about fornication, preach, preacher, preach. He talks about gossip, and the fellow never said a word. Afterwards, the preacher asked him, "What happened? You were just with me the whole way." He said, "Well, when you started talking about gossip, you quit preaching and started meddling." But that's the way people are, right? The minute you got on a subject that was sensitive and personal to me, now all of a sudden there's a problem. And that's what happens. The hope here is that when you see these things occurring, you'll recognize the reason they occur. They occur because folks forgot God. And if you don't like the results of forgetting God, what's the alternative? Become a believer, right? Go back to the righteousness revealed within the gospel. Get back to the things that are counter, or the things that bring us away from the consequences of these behaviors. That's where we're at. And so the judgment's coming. Even though they know it's coming, interestingly, by the way, I think Paul says, who knowing the judgment of God. By the way, how would they know the judgment of God? What would they have had?
The Old Testament.
Okay, they could go back into the Old Testament if they were, and they could go and see moments of where wickedness had been punished at the hands of God. They would know. Even the Gentile world knew about the things God had done. If you recall, when the spies come in and deal with, and Rahab finds them, and what was one of the things she said about the reason why she was helping them? That's right. The city had heard, the people living in Jericho had heard about what God had done in Egypt. They had heard about the things that He had done, and it was concerning to them that those folks that God had helped out of Egypt in the manner in which He helped them were camped not too far from town. People know. The history is there. So when he says, who knowing the judgment of God, I believe he means that very clearly. There was enough evidence of what God had done in relationship to wickedness for them to know what judgment of God meant and what it was. But they didn't care. Even though they knew the judgment of God comes against these things at some point, they weren't concerned. They weren't concerned that those which commit such things are worthy of death. Many of these things had the punishment of death in the Old Testament system. And though they knew all this, they refused.
Be careful who we associate in this world could lead us into these things.
Yeah, and I think that's the warning here. These are behaviors that we want to avoid. And so again, then the challenge is not only do the same, verse 32 at the end, but have pleasure in them that do them. That's a pertinent text. Not only should we not want to be involved in these behaviors, but we don't want to be associated in such a way that we're promoting it. And so we have to be careful in that regard as well.
The next verse, the first verse of the next chapter.
Yeah.
They shouldn't have cut it off right there, I don't think.
Yeah.
When we go back to like 25 and 26, we can't be hateful.
That's right.
Either. I mean, it gets overused a lot, but hate the sin, love the sinner, or words like that. But they just see you as hating the people.
Yeah. And some of that can be avoided if we use speech seasoned with grace. Some of that is just a natural result of people not liking to hear truth. And that's hard sometimes. I think sometimes we can avoid. We cause some of the vitriol that kind of come back because we kind of approach it with that kind of mindset. On the other hand, sometimes I think that we shy away from speaking the truth because we're afraid of offending. But truth is offensive sometimes. Truth to those who don't want it, and so there's a balance somewhere there. But you're right. I think that we can be guilty of approaching things with a lack of concern and almost you're worthy of death, and I'm glad. You know what I mean? And I think that's what we have to avoid. That's the kind of messaging, if you will, that certainly won't promote any kind of change or benefit to others. Somewhere we've got to be able to speak truth in love, speak it with grace, say what's true, but help others recognize that we say that as we would with any subject. And maybe the mistake we make is I don't know that we admit it as much as we live it. But we've created a hierarchy of sin. And we've got a list. And in our minds, here are the 3 or 4 that are just absolutely vile to me. And those that we'll just stomp and kick and pound our fist on. But I didn't count them all, but there's more than 4 that he said is vile affection and is a reprobate mind in this narrative. And I don't know that we can create a hierarchy where one is worse than the other. And maybe that's a mistake we make as well that kind of gives that impression where we care about this sin, but we let people get away with these over here all the time without a word being said. And that's a problem.
I kind of visualize, Ryan, what Paul was saying here by thinking of it, verse 21 and following. By visualizing a spiral. A spiral which starts with disrespecting God. Like a whirlpool in the water. We play around and we disrespect God. Pretty soon we become God. We have our own ideas and we begin spinning faster and faster and faster. And all these things, all these sins that we're talking about here are included from the top of that spiral to the bottom.
Yeah.
And once we reach the bottom, there's no hope.
Yeah. Any other?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Roger. I'm sorry.
One word we didn't touch on, I find very interesting in verse 31. Implacable in
Yeah.
King James.
Yeah.
Unforgiving.
Yeah. And I think that
It just goes along with every sequence is coming right down.
and if you think about it, all of these things are the exact opposite of what God is. And that's the challenge here. That's the challenge. And that unforgiving spirit part of that. Go ahead, Mary.
I've always wondered at what point have we done enough to honor God? As far as like in the world we live today, we tolerate being offensive with different people, how much they're allowed to do, but we are not allowed to say things. At what point do we say, okay, I've done enough to honor God, and He accepts that?
That's a hard question because I don't know that I don't know that we've ever done enough. That makes sense to you? That even when we've done all that we can, we're still unprofitable servants, the Bible says. And so I think that maybe the best answer to that that I could give you would be don't ever feel like I'm done. There are ways to go back. I mean, I try to strike a balance somewhere. I mean, on one side, I think we do need to use our voices, and because if we don't, we'll lose the ability to do that. I think that the easiest way to stymie and stop the Christian voice is really for us to cower in fear, to just simply tell the truth about God's word. And so But also, the Bible also teaches us that we pray that we just live a quiet and peaceable life. I don't know that God had in mind for us to be camped out protesting somewhere. I don't know that that's the way He desires for us. You know what I mean? I think that if we're striving to honor, first and foremost in our personal life, the purposes of God, encouraging the sphere of influence that I have to do the same, and then when the moment and opportunities are there to speak the truth of God's Word, to do the best we can to do that. I think that's a progression, not so much well, I've done enough, but just it's a continual progression throughout our lives to do that. But I think that there's evidence within Scripture. There were times where Jesus sent out His disciples and said, you'll come in some places and they'll completely reject everything you have to say and shake the dust off your feet and move on to the next town. I don't think God demands of us that we just keep pounding away at somebody who's refusing. I think there comes a point where, yeah, you can say, okay, I've done everything I can to help them understand this. They've rejected it, and it's time to move my energy somewhere else.
Right.
Yep.
I think the last chapter touched a little bit on that you're talking about the extreme of approving sin. In other words, you're not applauding the sins of other people, but you are still disapproving of those. You have to make a distinction. You have to make one or the other. I mean, either you're going to approve of their sin or you're going to disapprove of their sin.
Yeah. Yeah. And back to the whole of what Paul's driving at here. There's this sense again that he's contrasting the righteousness revealed in the gospel, justification by faith. Which of these two paths are you going to choose? Which of these two things do you want to honor? And one brings salvation, the other brings the judgment of God and condemnation. And so choose. Make a choice as to which path you want to take. And just so there's no confusion about righteousness and unrighteousness, he just lays it out for you. Here are the unrighteous paths that so many have chosen to take, and the challenges it brings to them. All right, jump to chapter 2. We've got just a few minutes, but so all that being said, and all that list of things that God has condemned, and you've witnessed the judgment of God against sin, he says, verse 32. You know the judgment of God against these things. Therefore, thou art inexcusable, O man. Whosoever thou art that judgest, for wherein thou judgest another, thou condemnest thyself. For thou that judgest doest the same things. But we are sure that the judgment of God is according to truth against them which commit such things. So here's this odd little connection. If there's a therefore, then there's something he's connecting to. All of these things that. Okay. But think about this. What we need to talk about, Lord willing, on Sunday is who's really making these judgments about what's righteous and unrighteous? God is. And that's really where we've got to make sure we settle in and be careful of establishing judgments based on any other standard than the standard of God. We'll talk about that, Lord willing, on Sunday. Especially the hypocrisy that he deals with. And our world could use a heavy dose of understanding about what hypocrisy is. From our politics to our media. Although there's a way off topic here for a second, but there is a sense of, to me, of I know about you, but I feel like maybe finally the truth of what's been going on in that world is finally coming to fruition. And it's finally being exposed for the what it is. And how many are being found out that yeah, and it's an amazing thing. It's an interesting little dynamic in our little society right now.